This is Professor Miller, and I am back with another lecture slideshow video. This one I have a PowerPoint for, so you'll want to have the viewer turned on so you can see the slideshow and my notes. Be sure to switch my face to minimized so that the icon disappears into the corner or vanishes completely, however you prefer. And so that also the PowerPoint slideshow is available for you to view. I'll also upload this slideshow to Canvas, where you can find it under the Files section if you'd like to look at it later for future reference. And today I will be introducing you to cultural studies. Cultural studies is another thing English departments do. Cultural studies is a collection of ways that English departments have changed over the years. It's one of the most wide-ranging kind of catch-all categories for English departments, where last class we looked at something very specific, archival research, and a method of writing books and papers which treats literature as a set of historical mysteries which can be solved through research. And we looked at the first chapter from my book, and in that lecture the mystery was how Walt Whitman came to write his poems, and I propose a reason, which we went over last class. So today we're going to look at a much broader way of looking at literature than archival research. And with that, I'll go ahead and jump right in with the PowerPoint slideshow. Cultural studies, what is it? Well, cultural studies is a phrase used to describe a variety of related changes that have taken place in the humanities, especially in English departments in colleges and universities in the United States and in Europe. Cultural studies originated in England among some left-leaning British academics in the late 60s and 70s, but it has exploded in popularity since then and has been subsequently taken up and transformed by scholars from many different disciplines around the world. So it started with English departments, but today you'll see cultural studies ideas at play in other departments like history, sociology, art, history, and so on. Still, it's most popular, to the extent that it's still popular, it's most popular in English departments. Cultural studies is related to another method, or I should say kind of theoretical method and collection of ideas that we've already looked at, called New Historicism, which we studied toward the beginning of the class. Related to New Historicism, cultural studies also places literary texts like poems, plays, stories in the context of other forms of cultural discourse. And what I mean by other forms of cultural discourse could be many different things, probably most importantly pop culture, but also history, advertising, political discourse, all kinds of things. So a typical cultural studies study, like an essay or book that is based in cultural studies, will take something that people have studied in the context of traditional English departments, like a poem by Walt Whitman, and look at it in the context of a kind of pop cultural phenomenon. In the case of the essay assigned for today, the pop cultural phenomenon, of course, is phrenology, the 19th century pseudoscience. But cultural studies is not only historical. Cultural studies extends to the present and affects canons, that is, canons of literature, meaning the books that we've chosen as classics to teach over and over again. Just like there's a canon in the Bible of accepted books that are approved as being originally a part of the Bible, so too there are canons in English departments which determine what is taught in English classes and what kinds of things we read and write about. More on cultural studies. What is it? Cultural studies scholars believe that art is never really for art's sake. According to cultural studies, art is always part of our broader culture. So cultural studies is against the idea of art for art's sake. Cultural studies believes art always arises in relationship to social needs, and it's not particularly interested in art that holds itself as separate from the world as it is. It's not interested in art that we might call ivory tower or elitist. Cultural studies grounds everything in the culture we all share, and it refuses to privilege high culture over so-called low culture or pop culture. Cultural studies holds them on the same ground, and it uses the same tools, more or less, to look at something as pop cultural as, like, say, a television cartoon, as opposed to something that would be associated with high culture, like an opera or an epic poem. Cultural studies doesn't privilege the opera or the poem. It looks at it in the light of what those other supposedly lower forms of cultural discourse can tell us about it. Cultural studies is avowedly and even radically interdisciplinary and can sometimes be anti-disciplinary. A key concern for cultural studies practitioners is the examination of the forces within and through which socially organized people conduct and participate in the construction of their everyday lives. That is to say that cultural studies is really fascinated by, is taken up by, and wants to figure out how ordinary people use culture to make reality and themselves, how all forms of culture contribute to the construction of self and the construction of society. So, what do cultural studies oriented essays and books read like? What does cultural studies work do? Well, one of the main things that cultural studies oriented work does is bring academic disciplines together, bridging gaps and crossing borders. Cultural studies combines all kinds of things, including feminist theory, social theory, ideology theory, political theory, history, philosophy, literary theory, political economy, translation studies. I could go on and on. It takes all of these different subfields and it uses them to study cultural phenomena in various societies. Thus, cultural studies seeks to understand how meaning is generated, disseminated, that means spread out in a culture, disseminated, and produced from the social, political, and economic spheres within a given culture. In practice, this often means more attention to cultural contexts and less attention to close reading and other forms of microanalysis. Close reading, of course, is when you look at a text and you take each word as being important and you really dig into the minutiae of the words and the sounds, and you look at things in the smallest level possible. You could say that this kind of studying, this kind of close study of language is like looking at language through a microscope. You take something small and you blow it up into something bigger. Cultural studies is not like that. Cultural studies doesn't drill in and deep into it by way of minutia and detail. Cultural studies takes a work and looks out from it at society. What is lost and gained by a cultural studies approach? Well, cultural studies holds the potential to make academic scholarship more relevant by connecting it to the world in more diverse ways. In some ways, it moves the focus on scholarship outside of the ivory tower. The ivory tower is a metaphor for, when scholars especially are too caught up in their own private world of studies and don't pay enough attention to the world outside of the walls of the university. That's what ivory tower means. What is lost and gained by a cultural studies approach? Well, it is often used to and can appeal to young people and to undergraduate students. My experience here at Stern and at all the schools that I've taught is that a lot of people, naturally, want to study culture that's closer to their own lives. Well, cultural studies, because it puts pop culture and supposed high culture on the same footing, appeals to people who would like to look at different kinds of media, maybe people who are tired of only reading books and would also like to study things like film, television shows, images of paintings and photography, even things that aren't normally regarded as fitting for study, like, say, advertisements or cards or, really any kind of social or historical discourse can be treated and examined by cultural studies. Why this appeals to students and young people is because it gives you a reason and a method for studying things that normally wouldn't get studied in the classroom. For example, I had one student in a class here at Stern write about Walt Whitman in relationship to references to Walt Whitman in a cartoon of The Simpsons. Walt Whitman came up as a reference a few different times, and this person really broke it all down and explained how The Simpsons redefined Walt Whitman for its own purposes. That's an example of using ordinary pop culture to look at something usually associated with high culture. I said lost and gained. So what are some of the risks? Well, there's a risk of losing sight of the artfulness of art if you use cultural studies methods. There's a risk, I should say, in cultural studies of robbing audiences of the pleasure and insight of great works, of breaking artistic standards. And I would add that breaking artistic standards, breaking them down, is a lot easier than creating new ones. After we've deconstructed what makes literature great, what's next? Well, that's a good question. Can English departments survive without defending and promoting their traditional field of study, that is, literature? I'm not sure. Verdict's still out on that one. Cultural studies during its heyday often replaced great canonical works of literature, the classics like Milton, Shakespeare, Dante, all that, with more recent textual cultural phenomenon. So you would take a classroom and maybe you would read one great play or story, but you might also spend a bunch of time on the lyrics to a song. Because according to cultural studies, whatever impacts culture and society is worth our study. We shouldn't limit our study to the kinds of things like ballet and opera and paintings that have been the traditional subject of culture. Culture is what we make of it. Culture is everything that people do together and all the artifacts they create together and leave behind. So it takes a broad definition of culture and thus broadens the whole field of English in terms of what you look at and how you look at it. Cultural studies assumes art and literature do cultural work. Cultural work, that's a phrase you hear a lot in cultural studies. By rendering art as a cultural practice that has tangible results, that is, by attaching pragmatic social value to art and literature, cultural studies operates under the assumption that literature has work to do, that literature is not here just for the sake of creating something pretty. It's not about art for art's sake. It's about what British scholars used to call cultural practice. The original left-leaning British scholars that created cultural studies looked at literature and art as a way of intervening in society and changing things, especially changing things politically. The phrase cultural work is also sometimes used to overcome the idea of art for art's sake. It's a pragmatic view of art and what it does. Cultural studies is interested in cultural artifacts of society and how these artifacts reveal deeper ideologies and hidden power systems. So you can look at television, cartoons, movies, or you can look at literature, poems like those by Whitman. Cultural studies places the high culture and the low culture on the same footing and sees what comes out. Cultural studies applies to the past as well as the present. Most people, when they first hear cultural studies, think of pop culture in the now. After all, when we hear the phrase pop culture, we usually think of things in our current moment. But culture has always had popular culture, or at least it has for as long as people have made a distinction between so-called high culture and everything else. Studying culture in the broader sense that cultural studies promotes is not just about studying the cultural artifacts of today. For example, until recently, Shakespeare's plays were seen as being transcendent of the culture that gave them birth. But today, thanks in part to cultural studies, we tend to look at Shakespeare differently. We tend to look at Shakespeare as someone whose work was embedded in a cultural practice of entertaining all kinds of people, from the working class groundlings who stood, I should say, in the cheap seats, the cheap standing area of the ground to watch his plays, to the aristocrats who sat up in the wealthy patrons' seats Everybody, rich and poor, showed up to watch Shakespeare. And Shakespeare knew that when he wrote his plays. So his plays are implicated in a whole variety of different class positions, poor to rich. This way of looking at Shakespeare as not just being written in the context of high poetry, but as being written as entertainment is a relatively new way of looking at Shakespeare that cultural studies has done a large bit to bring to us. Today's essay, the essay assigned for today by Nathaniel Mackey, is a cultural studies essay focusing on the pop cultural phenomenon from the mid-19th century known as phrenology. And it looks at Whitman in the context of phrenology. Whitman was caught up in this fad, this pseudo-scientific fad of studying the shapes and bumps on someone's head with the belief that you could, through analyzing bumps, determine the inner workings of the mind. Whitman, for better or for worse, bought into this pseudo-scientific idea, which has since, of course, been proven bogus, and his poems are influenced by it deeply. Nate Mackey takes a deep dive into this connection between Whitman and this pop cultural phenomenon from his day. Here are some discussion questions on phrenological Whitman, our assigned essay for today by Nate Mackey. Here's the first one. Cultural studies, as we just went over, looks at art and literature in the context of the immediate culture gave birth to it. How does this essay do that? How does this essay look at art and literature in the context of the immediate culture that gave birth to it? 2. Cultural studies focuses on how cultural practices, like here, for example, writing and reading poetry, relate to social and political forms of power and how it is used. How does this essay relate Whitman's poems to political forms of power? Another question we'll take up tomorrow. Also, what ideology is revealed in this ideological analysis of Whitman's use of phrenology? What ideology comes up? Finally, with all this in mind, how does Whitman use phrenology in his poems? What does he do with it? What cultural work does the idea of phrenology get done in Walt Whitman's great poem, Leaves of Grass? Well, let's take a look at these questions. You might want to revisit them before class tomorrow. I want to remind you we do have a guest in class tomorrow. Professor Linda Shires will be observing, so I do expect everyone to show up prepared. Let's try to have an especially good class tomorrow, a lively one that reflects that we're all doing the work. Bring questions if you're confused, but don't bring apathy. Don't bring a lack of interest. Let's try to have a great class tomorrow, all right? I'm looking forward to it, and I will see you all then when we'll take a look at these images and relate them to Whitman. For now, though, it's goodbye, and good luck reading the essay Phrenological Whitman by Nathaniel Mackey. I'll see you all later.